This is Between the Brackets, a Mediawiki podcast, episode 53, February 4th, 2020. Welcome to Between the Brackets. I'm Yaron Koren. My guest for this episode is Trevor Parscal, who is a software engineer at WikiHow. Although a lot of people listening to this podcast probably know him better as a developer at the Wikimedia Foundation, where he worked from 2008 to 2017. He worked on a number of high-profile projects, most notably the Vector Skin and VisualEditor. I actually got to work with Trevor when I briefly did some consulting work for the Wikimedia Foundation, creating an extension called Template Info back in 2010. Template Info was meant to store template information for use by VisualEditor. If all of that sounds familiar, you're probably thinking of the Template Data extension, which was created a few years later and does exactly that. I don't know why they created a new extension instead of using Template Info. Maybe we should have just picked a better name. Anyway, Trevor was very helpful during that time and just generally seemed like a very capable programmer, which I know he is anyway. So Trevor, it's great to talk to you again, and welcome to the podcast.
Great to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
Where do you live?
I live in Concord, New Hampshire.
Cool. We'll get back to that, I guess, but I want to talk about your time at the Wikimedia Foundation, but I'm actually not sure where to start because you were involved in so many things. Of all the projects you worked on, what are you most proud of in terms of the technical difficulty or the impact it's had?
I definitely have to say VisualEditor. I think both in its technical complexity or difficulty and also in its impact. I think it's probably made the biggest splash as far as user experience.
Yeah. So the first thing I knew you for was your work on the Vector Skin. We'll get to VisualEditor later, but
yeah.
I believe the whole Vector Skin project was part of the Wikipedia Usability Initiative group.
That's right. Yeah.
That group was headed by a woman named Naoko Komura, whom we both know.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, Vector was created around 2009, I think, and it's still the default skin for Mediawiki and on Wikipedia, so that's the Wikipedia look and feel that everyone knows. What was your involvement with that project?
So, due to sort of a quick, let me put it this way. Since that project got off the ground rather quickly, it was pretty much the first time the Wikimedia Foundation had ever accepted grant money for specific work to be done.
Right.
They had to staff up pretty quick. We brought on Paru Vora, who was like a designer and especially helped a lot in doing all the lab testing type of stuff. And we also brought on like a senior engineer who didn't last very long. And there was sort of some staffing rotation happening at the time. So I ended up kind of doing most of it. Both from a design and implementation standpoint, and it was a bit crazy because we were really trying to put the team together at the same time, and that was really like the first thing we did.
Yeah. Okay. So what were you doing there on Vector?
So the first thing we did is we looked at users in a lab trying to use both the skin and the editor, just so general navigation on the site and also using the editor to make really basic edits. And it's pretty painful to watch somebody try to use Wikipedia when they don't have a lot of experience. It's especially in those days because it was, there's no visual editor and there are very few usability oriented changes. Pretty much everything had been done by volunteers to scratch various itches. So that said, Vector kind of came out of observing like a few basic things. I would say it was a very modest change to monobook. The community generally saw it that way, although I think there were certainly a subset of the community at the time that thought Vector was just the worst. And there was lots of comments about like how we shouldn't look like Apple, and not that it really ever made us look like Apple, but any nudge in that direction I think kind of turned people off. So it was intentionally meant to be a quite modest change, and also to that effect, there was a lot of code that had been written expecting the HTML output of the skin to be a certain way for various gadgets to work. And so
Right.
because of that, we actually tried to be as similar as we could to the same HTML output to break as few things as possible. So it was based on the same code. It was outputting really similar code, and it was outputting very similar, in my opinion, graphics. But it was significant enough of a change that we did observe some usability improvements, mostly in navigation.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I thought it was a more substantial change than that. I mean, you're making it sound like it was just a set of CSS and image changes or something.
There was a little more to it. Part of it, too, was that we had to get this working in Internet Explorer 5.5. Thankfully, 5.3 on Mac was below the threshold of what we kind of decided as far as market penetration. But at the time, you got to think IE 5.5 on PC. So there were a lot of things that you really had to hack away at to get working. And there used to be even some code in the vector skin that would output the personal items menu backwards if you were in a right to left language, because
Right.
the CSS support for flowing them backwards was not compatible all the way through. So there was all kinds of crazy things that we did. Eventually, we were able to peel those layers back, and it became a lot cleaner code. But there was, getting it to work in those older browsers took a lot of work, and I'd say like the gadget compatibility took a lot of work too, because we did start with like kind of a new template. But I would just say that there was like really dramatic things like a fixed width and things like that that I think were tossed around, and I ultimately was able to sort of, I think, convince the team that we needed to be as minimalist as possible and make only changes that would have actual impact on usability and not make too many frivolous visual changes that would just upset the community. And so what you actually see in Vector is like an evolution and like removing as many lines as we can to try and clean up the interface, but otherwise only the navigation split is really is like the biggest change.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I didn't realize there were that many, compromises involved in the creation of Vector. Because when you look at it, it looks so clean and,
Yeah, and the style was really popular at the time. I think I remember that Google, about a week or two after we launched Vector, released a version of the Google search engine that had those gradient lines on it, and that was sort of a trend. And I think that trend's long past, obviously. But the amazing thing is that the Vector skin is still basically as I designed it so many years later. I think 10 years later, at least.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. I mean, does that surprise you that the Vector is still the default skin for Mediawiki? Yeah, it has been 10 years.
It does surprise me.
And there's no sign that it'll get replaced anytime soon.
Yeah, it does surprise me. There is a timidity that I think I did not have, but it seems like I guess most others still do. When I came into the foundation, I kind of got a look at the landscape, decided this parser's stupid, the skin's ugly, and I was not hesitant to tell people about that. And that wasn't particularly popular with some of the people who'd been there a while, but at the same time, I think there were also people like Brian Vibber who were happy to admit, like, yeah, you're right, that is crap, let's fix it. And so I think there's kind of a mix. But I just kind of came in guns blazing, so to speak, and decided that I was going to fix all these problems. But what happens is the longer something like that is up, it actually makes it feel like the more untouchable it is. And I think if it had been changed after a couple years, we wouldn't have thought much of it. But now that it's been there for 10 years, I think it needs to be a big initiative. There's going to end up being some grant for it and some big presentation at Wikimedia for it or something, because it just becomes this big deal. Whereas I kind of imagined, okay, we're never going to leave it stale for more than a few years ever again. And, I figured it would be changing all the time.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there actually is an initiative to redo the desktop interface. It's not clear whether that's going to involve changing vector or creating a new skin or what. Although it doesn't seem like they're talking about changing the look and feel, at least the visual display of it that much. It's more just adding features like having a floating search bar and that kind of. Oh well, there's a bunch of things, but it won't necessarily change the overall display.
Well, a lot of the stuff they've done on the mobile side, of course, where it's a lot more blue sky. Because the mobile site isn't even really a wiki, right? It's not like a fully functioning. You can't do everything.
Right.
You can't do like review and things like that. Sorry if that's not true anymore. That was definitely true at the last time I checked. But it's at least a highly limited version. And because of that, there aren't a lot of community people on it. And it's easier to do a lot of fast-moving development there. And I think that's cool. And I do like the way a lot of the things on mobile have ended up looking at everything, but the hesitance to bring that stuff over the desktop is a little more extreme than I expected.
Yeah. It sounds like things were more fluid in general. I mean, you're talking about, you were brought in as a programmer, but you understood both the front end side of CSS and the back end with PHP, and you had a certain design sensibility also.
Yeah, it was
so
different
you
back
could,
then.
bridge those worlds, and maybe because it's more stratified now, there's no one person who has the authority to.
Yeah, stratified is definitely a way to say it. Well, I was the 20th employee, right, and I was the first person that they hired on who had a software design background.
Oh, really? Wow.
My title was never designer, but at that time, people were just doing what they had to do to get things done. And so, yeah, I designed a lot of things. The WikiEditor toolbar as well, and pretty much all of VisualEditor is also my design work. So it would just kind of creep in. And I think that a lot of like the early days, yeah, it was just people just making do with what they had and just getting it done. But now it is a larger organization, and my understanding is that it's still growing quite quickly. So I don't know how they're gonna stay nimble. But that's a different challenge than I had, at least in those early days. It definitely slowed down toward the end of my tenure there.
Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to ask about WikiEditor. You mentioned that one too. It came around the same time as Vector, and it might have been part of the same usability initiative.
It was, yeah.
Okay. So for those who don't know, it's basically a toolbar with buttons that let you add wiki text for formatting. It's not WYSIWYG, but it's still pretty useful. And you can see it in use on Wikipedia.
So we hired a usability testing firm, and they worked with Parvora, and who was on our team, and we did all this lab testing. So then we have this meeting, and we sit in this conference room, and this is when we're still over on Stillman Street, and it's still a really small group of people, like everyone important's in the room, and they basically say, well, what you really need is a visual editing experience, like a WYSIWYG editor.
Right.
But we'd already really committed to making so many specific deliverables, because the grant work requires you to kind of predict the future, at least the way we didn't have a lot of experience writing grants at the time either, to be fair. And so even though I think everyone in the room agreed that was the right direction, we really weren't like staffed for it. We had another year worth of work to make improvements to the toolbar based on all this usability research. And so that didn't really start right away. It was just something that it was a recommendation that everyone acknowledged but had to sort of ignore. And so the toolbar was really like the in-between effort to try and fix a lot of those usability issues. And so what was crazy about that project is that we probably spent half of our time implementing a feature that we released for about a day and then pulled back because we could never quite get it to be stable enough, and the usability of it wasn't very good. And this is the template encapsulation feature.
Okay.
Most people probably have never seen this before, but essentially we were able to use a content editable div to render the wiki text code, which gave us syntax highlighting. It allowed us to do like inline dialogues right there on the wiki text. And we also were able to take sections, for instance, like the start and end of a template, and collapse them into little capsules. Because we basically found in usability testing that when most articles have like really big templates at the beginning, and that was really off-putting to people who were trying to edit maybe the second paragraph, for instance.
Yeah, okay.
So
Yeah.
the problem, of course, is that it turns out a lot of what people want to edit is in those templates.
Well, yeah.
And by collapsing them, you made it impossible to search within them, either visually or even just using basic search tools in your browser. So it just became kind of a rabbit hole of how do we re-implement all this stuff, and how do we fix these navigation problems that we just caused. And the copy-paste was a nightmare. Browsers at the time were even worse than they are now. And so we had these huge matrices of sources and destinations as far as like, where they copied from and which browser they're copying into. And
Oh, man.
and we were working on that. And that it just was such a long tail that we decided that we were just going to have to call it. And that was hard because we'd made a lot of promises to the donor, but I think that we were able to manage it okay. And we still had a good relationship with the donor after that. So
Yeah. That was part of the WikiEditor extension, or is it a separate thing?
it was part of the WikiEditor extension. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, like, I think the template info thing that you and I worked on together was actually for that. And
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
yeah, and because it didn't really get launched, I think it was really opaque about what was going on there. I mean, it got launched for a couple of days and we had to pull it back because a bunch of articles got corrupted from copy-paste issues. But yeah, I think that eventually when we came up with template data, I think that mostly represented a move away from XML and toward JSON, if anything at all.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
You'll have to ask Timo Teihoff about that one.
Okay, I
think
will.
he's
No,
the
I'm
template
not.
data
Yeah,
guy.
no, I was joking.
I
It's
just give
not
you
like-
That's fine. It's fine. But it was
I'm not, like,
basically the same
haunted by
concept,
my-
and I think that there was a moment too where someone in VisualEditor meeting was like, "Oh, we just need this," and I'm like, "Well, we have that. Look, it's here," and everyone's like, "What is this? I've never heard of this before." And
Oh, okay. Yeah.
so it was good that we had that in our back pocket, but I think it did get involved.
Yeah. Hopefully there was some lessons learned from template info that went into template. It doesn't matter.
It was. There was. Don't use XML, which is I at the time I don't think either of us saw that. So
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I remember there was a whole struggle with like DTDs. Anyway.
yep.
Okay. Enough XML talk. So. Well, I guess I have a similar question with WikiEditor. Is are you surprised people are still using that? I don't know. I mean, that's kind of, it gets into visual editor stuff too. But.
Yeah, well, I actually think WikiEditor is one of those tools where actually when I see third-party wikis not using it, it surprises me the most because I see them using the ancient toolbar, and there are just so many usability improvements that I was involved in making and I know so intimately in the WikiEditor code.
Yeah.
It surprises me that people are still in the Stone Age. But yeah, I would say that like the WikiEditor project really was very responsive to the actual problems that users had in trying to complete basic tasks. The existing toolbar, pretty much anything beyond bold and italic, nobody had any idea what any of those buttons did. And the new toolbar had integrated help. And it had a...
Yeah, so you mean if you hover over a button, it shows more information?
Yeah, but there's actually like Wikitext help at the end of the menu of the toolbar. There's a number of things. And so, but we did all sorts of things in direct response to user problems at the time. Basically segueing both chronologically and, conceptually here, between this and VisualEditor, what happened is after building this and working on it, especially the template encapsulation thing, I really cut my teeth on this whole content editable thing, because that's what we were dealing with the template encapsulation thing. Even though we were making a source code editor, we had to use content editable to render anything special and rich inside the code editing experience. And so I really cut my teeth on that, and it gave me enough experience that I could start working on VisualEditor as a side project. And I knew all of the shortcomings and all of the usability problems very, very well, because I had sat through hours and hours and hours of usability testing. And so in the design of VisualEditor, it really was informed by all of that lab testing. And I think that's one of the reasons why the project was so successful, is because it was a really well-informed project, both from the community side and from the user side, especially the novice user side.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought of that. WikiEditor was sort of a dry run for VisualEditor in some sense, although it's useful in its own right.
Yeah.
Wait, well, you mentioned content editable. That term sounds familiar.
Content editable is a technology that browsers implemented to varying degrees, starting as early as, I think, even like the late 90s, if not early 2000s. And essentially, it was done extremely poorly by Microsoft, and then everyone emulated whatever they did, bugs and all. And then much later on, around the same time as VisualEditor kicked off, a number of improvements started coming out on browsers to support content editable a lot better, and it eventually even made its way onto mobile, which kind of triggered a bit of a U-turn in VisualEditor development, because originally VisualEditor didn't even use content editable, because the first lesson that I learned about content editable from WikiEditor was not to use it.
Okay.
And and so early VisualEditor actually did not use content editable at all, and that was our strategy for being supported on mobile, because at the time we didn't know it eventually would come to mobile, but it looked like an abandoned technology that was not supported by mobile. And we said, if we're going to be supported on mobile, then we're going to have to come up with our own way to do this. And so I actually created something called Edit Surface, which was sort of like a synthetic editing experience in just divs, and everything was like laid out manually. So I would do text wrapping myself and text selection boxes myself, and the cursor was just like a div that I would just like blink on and off, and like everything was completely faked, but it looked and felt just like a normal WYSIWYG editor, and we'd still use HTML to do rendering, but that was it. Like every single time that we needed to change anything, we had to re-render. And then we eventually came up with selective re-rendering, which is really like, we were doing like what React is doing with user interfaces. We were doing that with VisualEditor at a really early stage. So the idea of like surgically and automatically fixing, synchronizing between like a virtual DOM tree and in the actual DOM. So that's the way that we got performance out of that system. And then eventually we decided to switch to content editable, but it was actually a fair amount later.
Yeah. Okay. So that code you created to simulate an edit is no longer.
Yeah, that's not used anymore. I mean, I'm really proud of having created that code. Because it was what we needed to get over a certain number of hurdles, as far as getting executives on board and convincing other engineers to be on board. But ultimately, we were working with with a couple of guys from Wikia, and there was a lot of push on their side to do mobile really, really early, and they were starting to see that mobile was supported. Well, mobile was finally now supporting content editable. And there's just things like what happens when you press a spacebar twice, that if you're not using content editable, it's very difficult to emulate. And when you build a text editor, you realize how sophisticated the interactions are with text editors that most people take for granted. But we were pretty knee deep in this, right? So we knew about all these edge cases, and so it was easy for us to appreciate that a lot of these sophisticated and like nuanced interactions were actually taken care of for you on the input side when you used content editable. And so it made it kind of worth revisiting that as a rendering technology. But because we had done it ourselves prior, we had a completely separated data model. And because that was written in a nice enough way, we were able to keep the exact same data model and run a different front end. And we actually ran them both at the same time for a period of time, sort of competing for who could close the number of bugs that were sort of the hurdles between. And so at one point, the team actually split a bit, and we actually implemented both at the same time to sort of see which one was more viable.
Oh, wow. Yeah, okay. Who could work better on IE6, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, well, there was just certain things like, well, we don't have spell check support, and you get that for free, but you don't have, the ability to protect a piece of content from being edited, and we do, because we get that for free. And so they had to go figure out how to protect a piece of content, and we had to go figure out how to get spell check, and and then the race was on. We just tried to figure out how we could implement the things that each other had sort of accomplished. And in the end, I decided that it was much better to go with content editable after really looking at how browsers were taking it up again. And the mobile support was just like absolutely critical too.
Yeah, okay. That's cool though. That's like something straight out of that book Soul of a New Machine.
I'm not sure if I've read that one, but
oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, it was emotional for me because a big amount of what made VisualEditor important and unique at the time was our decision to go the Google Docs route and to make a synthetic editing service, which by the way, that's what Google Docs was doing at the time as well.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, it makes sense. I figured everything they were doing was custom.
Yeah.
On Google Docs.
Yeah. And at one point, a product manager from Google talked to me on the phone and basically said, "You guys should just use Google Docs."
That's interesting.
And I said, "Well, everything we do has to be open source, so I don't think that we can even have that conversation." Aside from the fact that I don't think it would work, but also it's a moot point because we'd had to have everything open source. And they said, well, we think that we could maybe negotiate to open source the front end of Google Docs to be able to pull that off. But you guys would still have to use the same back end as us. And that will never be open because it's like Bigtable and everything. Yeah. And we just can't make that happen. So I felt like as much as I'd really, really love to be participating in getting the front end of Google Docs open sourced, it just wasn't really viable for the Wikimedia Foundation because we just couldn't store all of our users' data in Google's data centers.
Yeah, sure. But it's interesting. Yeah, I guess it's indicative of how high profile a project it was.
Yeah, they heard about us a lot because early on in VisualEditor, we decided that we were going to try and plan for the future as far out as we could possibly see it. And one of the things that we knew was going to be just around the corner, especially with Google Docs already having this feature set, was real-time collaboration. And so what we did is we reached out to and had many, many meetings with Google Wave, developers, sure. And then later ex-Google Wave developers because they canned that during this period of time. And then later, a lot of those people moved over to Google Docs, and some of those were original Writely engineers who had moved over to Google Docs when they got acquired, because Google didn't even develop Docs from scratch. They actually just bought Writely.
Oh, okay.
And so anyway, so we had talked to them, and we talked to the Etherpad people who also got bought by Google. And so Google sort of knew about us because we were constantly talking to a bunch of their engineers that were working in this space. And their engineers were really helpful, and they gave us all sorts of advice about what it's like to be working on maybe a later stage project once you've already got to the point where you're doing real-time collaboration. And because of that, we designed a lot of the architecture around VisualEditor to ensure that we weren't shooting ourselves in the foot, so that later on it would be as effortless as possible to integrate real-time collaboration. And that actually proved to be true, we proved to have done that successfully, I guess you'd say, because we now do have real-time collaboration functioning in VisualEditor, although it's not deployed on Foundation servers.
Oh, Okay, I don't think I knew that. I mean, I know people have been talking about real-time collaboration for, well, I guess
Yeah.
for the last 10 years. It would work like Etherpad, and multiple editors can edit a page at the same time.
Yes, it works quite well. Really, credit goes to David Chan and Ron Gitao and Ed Sanders for really doing the implementation on that. It was a bit after I'd already stepped away from the engineering side of VisualEditor. But I'm actually working on a personal project with David Chan on the side, where we're working on real-time collaboration in multiple languages simultaneously using machine translation. So you and I can work on a document that's the same document in different languages and never have to speak each other's language, and all the magic just happens.
All right, sounds good. When can we expect?
I have no idea on that one. There are a lot of really interesting design challenges and engineering challenges with that, but I think overall it really has turned out that the architecture of VisualEditor was well thought out enough, sort of future-proof enough that we've been able to bolt on all sorts of really ambitious features, some of which are a little bit more down to earth, like table editing, let's say. And
Right.
And it's held up. We haven't had to start over just to implement that one thing. So it's gone well. And I think that's, to your earlier question, that's one of the reasons why I'm the most proud of that accomplishment, because I think architecturally it was a very sound piece of software that's really held up.
Yeah. So just briefly on the real-time collaboration thing, you're saying it is possible, it is supported already within the JavaScript, but
There's a
the
collab
backend
server.
doesn't support it, or what?
There's a collab server package out there on GitHub, and you run that, and then you can basically point a slightly tweaked version of VisualEditor at that, and you can have multiple people working on the same HTML document at the same time.
Okay, cool.
So the technology is there. It would need to have more work to be integrated, and I think that the biggest challenge around real-time collaboration at the Wikimedia Foundation, specifically in the Wikipedia project, is the idea of multiple attribution. Because the wiki is not
Right.
designed or conceptualized around the idea of multiple attribution. But real-time collaboration, obviously, is inherently multiple attribution. And so that's the biggest challenge, I think. There's a user experience challenge. I've definitely had so many conversations in that team and with those folks, about how to accomplish that. And we have lots of ideas, but I think ultimately there needs to be some willingness in the community to work with the foundation to come up with the right solutions, because I think there's a justifiable amount of caution around making changes to the attribution model.
Yeah.
It's pretty core to the way the wiki works.
Yeah, but I guess you're saying ultimately it's not so much a technical problem as a conceptual problem, or I don't even know what.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And I think it could be huge, but I think it's not going to work the way that a lot of existing systems work. I think, it'll probably end up something like you can manually invite people to edit with you rather than just showing up at the edit page and there's a bunch of things going on, for instance. And there's going to be a lot of different ways that we are able to overcome that. But at the moment, I think there just hasn't really been enough interest to get that deployed to solve all those problems.
Yeah. Okay. So back to VisualEditor. Speaking of having to create everything yourselves, there's also it's all based around a custom JavaScript library called OOJS.
Yeah.
And one on top of that called OOUI, although it used to be called OOJS UI or something.
Yeah. I mean, essentially what happened is we needed something, and things like React, which again are really basically just the UI version of what we were already doing inside of VisualEditor, they hadn't really been popularized yet, and we just kind of made some ad hoc things to do a widget library. And Wikipedia is, Mediawiki didn't really have any kind of standard way to generate a button or anything like that. So we made our own. And then I took a step back from the project for a little while just to take a little break, and I yanked all that stuff out of VisualEditor and made it into a standalone library, and that's kind of what it became. And and then there was a number of initiatives to standardize that throughout the software. And now in Mediawiki, there's a PHP implementation and a JavaScript implementation that even kind of work together. So you can generate something in PHP, like a button, and then it gets infused on the front end and becomes, something that the JavaScript can interact with using an API rather than just having to manipulate the HTML, things like that. So that became a more robust, larger library used throughout the Wikimedia Foundation. But it essentially was just born from necessity within VisualEditor and then split out later.
Yeah. If the project were being done now, would it still make sense to create an internal, not internal, but a new JavaScript library for MediaWiki uses, or would it make sense to use Angular or React or one of those?
It's a hard call. I think I would probably develop it more. I think if I had to do it again, I would have leaned into the existing dynamic DOM updating technology that we had in VisualEditor and basically built React. But I don't think that we saw the user interface updates as being like our biggest hurdle, and so we did something a little simpler and faster to develop, not to run. But I've since done some personal projects using things like incremental DOM, which is what YouTube uses. And I definitely see a lot of value in that, in the React style way of updating the DOM, which is one of the reasons why we did it in VisualEditor. So it's possible that I would have done it differently for that reason, but there's kind of like a problem with adopting external libraries into MediaWiki. So this causes I guess a lot of people look at it as a not invented here syndrome, but you really like the experience of being a engineer at the Wikimedia Foundation is that you are given less resources and more problems than everyone else in the tech industry. And that's fun as an engineer because there's a lot, you're surrounded by all these brilliant people who are up to the challenge, and it's exciting. It's also frustrating and challenging, but but it is, I always thought of it as like a fun challenge. And so, we had to make everything work in every language from the start, not like, well, eventually we'll get around to internationalization. And we had to make everything work in a way wider range of browsers than any other third-party library would ever care to bother with. And we had to do that from the start, not eventually. And it was just like, every single turn, there would always be this thing where there's like, okay, well, we made this thing internally, and people would be like, well, why aren't you using this existing library? And we'd say, well, there's these 4 things that it doesn't do. And then like 6 months later, it gets abandoned, which, by the way, is the third thing, which is that when you rely on other people and then they decide to go a different way, then you end up having to be the owner of the library anyway. So ultimately, it doesn't really save you all that much. Okay, so this has happened repeatedly. So what about like jQuery UI? The Wikimedia Foundation was like, jQuery's solid. jQuery UI, wow, that's like, what could be more solid than that? Let's base all of our stuff on that. Well, it's like abandoned now. So like, what do we do now? And there's tons of stuff in MediaWiki that still uses that, or at least up until very recently. And so it takes a lot of effort to undo all that integration. And so, and jQuery UI was designed to be so generic that our specific needs, it was actually a bit of a heavyweight tool for that. And that's another problem, is that they're not really designing for your specific needs. And so you end up with a bunch of like cruft and extra junk you don't need. And the last example is in VisualEditor. Early on, we didn't have a lot of core expertise in our team on text selection APIs. And so to kind of jump that hurdle and get ahead a little bit, we decided to use something called Rangy. Well, even at the time, Rangy hadn't really been updated in 6 months, but we didn't realize that it was never going to get updated again. And it was really the most robust text selection library on the internet. So we said, well, it works all right now, but browsers kept changing. We kept finding bugs. We were fixing things. We'd send them upstream to a ghost town. Eventually, we just decided, I guess we own Rangy. And then eventually we realized that as we kept going and going and going, we were only using 1 or 2 functions from Rangy. So we re-implemented only those 2, dropped like 6 kilobits out of the payload, and we owned it. It was now just part of VisualEditor. So this happens all the time. So people don't often see far enough into the future to realize that as soon as Facebook has, some new thing, React is going to be some niche community of old timers, and there's going to be some new shiny thing that has all the money behind it. And it's fun to ride the train while everyone's on it, and there's all this energy and money behind it. But these really big companies are just, they're fickle. There's somebody right now at Facebook or a team of them that are working on the new thing that's going to replace React, and then all this React code that everyone's writing right now is going to be out of date. So I'm not saying it's bad to use React, but you have to kind of decide, like, how long-term is my project in comparison to theirs? And I think at the Wikimedia Foundation, unlike a personal project or even a commercial project, because commercial projects are often short-lived just out of, like, business reasons. But unlike that, everything we do at the Wikimedia Foundation, everything I did at the Wikimedia Foundation, I tried to make it like archival quality, because everything you're writing is literally archived forever, and also it needs to be able to survive as long as possible, because that saves a lot of engineering money down the road, and they're short on resources. I mean, maybe not as much as they used to be, but that was the culture at the time when there was only 20 of us, right? So it's a really different approach to this whole not invented here syndrome, where everyone's going like, well, obviously the cheapest thing to use is just all the existing open source stuff. But there's so many externalities to that down the road that you have to be really careful about doing that. And you certainly don't want to just like subscribe to the religion of like always use, the most popular open source library at the time, because things change.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It makes a lot of sense. I guess instead of not invented here, you could say not maintained here, or not maintained anywhere or something.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is the maintenance overhead. You got to be ready to take it on.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, I'm planning for this summer's Google Summer of Code project. I have a project to switch from jQuery UI to OO UI for one of my extensions page forms. I was amazed that jQuery UI was like the standard library for basic interface elements and stuff, and then they just one day stopped working on it.
And I'm sure at some point it was like Ressig's pet project, but it's just not the way people do stuff anymore. Yeah. And everybody who hitched their wagon to that is in trouble.
Yeah. Well, it still works, but
that will change.
Eventually, won't.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask briefly. So you mentioned a few people that you were working with, including a guy named Rowan Katow. It seems like for a lot of these projects that you did, you were working with him. With Rowan. He hasn't been on the podcast yet. I'm hoping he'll be on before too long. It just seems like wherever your name shows up, his name also shows up.
That wasn't by accident.
What?
That was not by accident.
Oh, okay.
When I was doing the Usability initiative, I went to a meetup in Berlin. And we're hanging out at Seabase. I don't know if you ever had the opportunity to go there. Kind of a cool little hacker space in downtown Berlin.
Yeah, I was there once, just for an evening. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, great place, and just hanging out, and I was just immersing myself in all these volunteers. I'd been at the foundation for less than a year, and one of the volunteers I met was Roan. We hit it off really quickly, and we were hiring at the time, but he was only 17, and so I was able to kind of finagle it so we were able to hire him. And he was still in high school, and he worked as a contractor for a while. Finished college all the way through, in the Netherlands, and then he moved to the United States, and we sat next to each other for years and years and worked on things together. So you're picking up on a deep friendship. He's a really good friend of mine, and also I think that I've always had a way of collaborating really well together. He's good at all the things I suck at, and I think vice versa. Although it's hard to find things that he sucks at. But yeah, we always did a really great job, I think, when we worked together on things.
That's really interesting. So did he even know about Mediawiki or anything when you met him, or did
Oh
you?
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, the reason he was at Seabase is because that he was the I guess sort of the person left holding the bag on maintaining the API when the previous person who had kind of put it all together had kind of decided to go work on something else. And so, he was already a pretty established volunteer in the community and well known. It certainly wasn't like controversial, the idea of hiring him, outside of the fact that he was, obviously pretty young. It could only work part time. At the time, we were looking for, a real serious career person who could come in full time and work at a desk. And I'm like, well, there's this high school kid in the Netherlands who could work part time from his house in his spare time when he's done with his homework. And it took a minute, but I mean, we'd already started hiring some other sort of younger people, and definitely a lot of people on contract work. So it wasn't too crazy, but yeah. But that was definitely a good hire. And he's still at the foundation. He's been a very important person to Mediawiki for a long time. Well before I ever got involved. I can't take any credit for all the amazing things that he's done.
Well, you can take some credit, I think.
I like to think that I mentored him, but I think he mentored me a lot more. But yeah, anyway, very, very amazing engineer. And but yeah, the things that we worked on together included all the stuff, the usability initiative, and also then we took a break from the front end because we were so sick of the community yelling at us for changing things. And then he and I actually we created ResourceLoader.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that too. Yeah. Well, great. I guess
Ask away.
That's a very good segue.
Yeah, ask away.
Yeah. Okay. I think you guys started working on that around 2011, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, basically what was going on is there was not really a clever way to get front-end resources to the client. Usability Initiative was adding front-end resources at a pretty alarming rate.
Oh, okay.
And and Roan and I both believed in this, like, JavaScript is the future, the front end is the future, and we were just on board with that. That was not the prevailing wisdom at the time.
Oh, okay.
The only other person at the foundation who really believed in this was this guy who didn't work at the foundation at all, just happened to work in our office. His name's Michael Dale. He now works. Sure. He now works at like a video place. I forget the name of it, but Crunchyroll or something.
Or, I don't know.
No, well, they got
a different one.
They dissolved. I think he works at Crunchyroll now. But anyway, he's an expert in client-side video delivery, and he had put together a way to watch videos using all open source technologies, which was really challenging at the time, and that needed way more front-end resources. And so he had come up with all these ways to dynamically load things, and this is before this was easy and convenient. So he wanted to implement sort of a genericized version of his front-end resource loading software into Mediawiki. But on the other side was Tim Starling, who has a long history at the foundation, especially being a back-end guy. So he saw all the challenges from the back-end perspective, and rightly saw there was lots of performance issues that needed to be paid attention to, and they were on two really extreme sides of this problem, to the point where they really couldn't see eye to eye on many things. And both very talented engineers in their own right. They just had very different styles of communication and engineering, and very different interests. So Roan was a lot more effective at communicating with Tim Starling, and I was much more effective at communicating with Michael Dale. And so the CTO at the time, I was able to persuade that if you just put me and Roan in the middle, we can kind of make the two sides get along, and they can stop reverting each other and writing different versions of this and at the same time, and all the kind of craziness that was happening at the time. So that's basically what she went for it. And so that we basically, based on the ideas that both had, and a whole bunch of our own ideas. We just created a new system that both of them were happy with, and that was like the major part of the, I think it was the 118 release.
Yeah, 116 maybe.
Maybe 117. I don't know. But it's been so long ago.
Yeah,
but
I did some research for it. So
it was a really good collaboration between the four of us, really. But kind of me and Roan running interference between two people who were having a challenging time getting it done.
That's very interesting. It's like a chocolate and peanut butter kind of origin story.
Yeah, and Roan's just hardcore back-endy enough, and I'm just kind of hardcore front-endy enough. I think it kind of worked, but
okay,
it was,
right.
But it was and I think that it kind of speaks to the kind of really magical thing that happens when you get people together who kind of complement each other's skills. But it also shows that like they still have to be close enough, because you could argue that like the difference between those two guys also they in theory complement each other's skills, but they're not close enough. So it's kind of tough. But if you can find it, like what Roan and I have found is that we're just close enough in the middle that we can kind of speak the same language. It works real well.
Yeah. So just for people who don't know about ResourceLoader, well, let me try explaining and tell me if this is correct.
Go for it.
The idea is you register every extension or every piece of code, skin, anything else, registers its JavaScript and CSS with one central thing, the ResourceLoader, all in that's all PHP code, and that in turn essentially creates one big JavaScript file and one big CSS file, or at least one big JavaScript file that's minimized and has all this stuff, because it's a lot easier for the browser to deal with one file versus 100 different files. It's a lot faster.
Yeah, that's close. I would say the thing I would sort of emphasize around that description, though, or maybe change a little bit, is that especially browsers at the time, but this is still generally true with the exception of HTTP2, which is sort of somewhat removes the need for ResourceLoader, but not totally. The biggest problem as far as getting a page to load quickly is the number of sequential requests. And so even though browsers can download some things in parallel, what happens is you download a piece of CSS and then it tells you about some images and you go download the images. And so there's this chain that happens. And those chains are especially damaging to page load speed. So you want to reduce the number of total requests, and you also want to reduce the number of requests that had to happen in sequence. And so what we did is when we had learned this enough from, at the time, reading some web performance books that had sort of, maybe paved the way for this kind of thinking and everything. But what we did is we figured out that, one, gzip is amazing. So you can pack a lot of stuff into one single request, and between HTTP slow start, which makes it so that the first bit of a file is kind of sent at a slower, in small chunks and takes longer, versus once you get up to a larger file size, you're basically streaming data at an incredible rate, very large chunk size. And so actually one big resource is always going to download a lot faster than like 5 smaller, really small resources of the same size, right? Especially if they're in series, because of all of the HTTP overhead. And then it's even better because gzip compresses things across all that data. And so we basically just kind of kept coming up with all these crazy ways to use gzip to our advantage. And so, anyways, that's the fundamental concept of ResourceLoader, is to have as few requests as possible, and to not be too afraid to make some of those requests a little bigger. Like a bloated request isn't really a bad thing. It's just that you need to have very few of them and you need to avoid series. So basically all the things, all the bells and whistles that makes ResourceLoader easy to use and everything, those are really important, because we thought developer happiness was really, really critical, since everyone had to rewrite everything. They were going to be grumpy. But at the same time, like that's why it was successful, is because the underlying concept of it, I think, was really sound. And I think that generally still holds up today.
Yeah. So I've never actually heard of another application other than Mediawiki that does that kind of central resource management, although I'm sure there are. Do you know of other applications that either helped inspire Mediawiki's resource loader or possibly were inspired by it to create their own resource loading system?
I do think we were ahead of the curve. I didn't really know of anything that worked dynamically. Things like Closure Compiler did work, but obviously only really did anything for static resources that could be compiled together and everything like that. But yeah, we were a bit ahead of our time. WordPress ended up picking up like this in-queue system somewhat after us. And yeah, I think there were a number of other systems that were somewhat dynamic. But the really unique thing about Wikimedia, and this kind of goes back to the thing I was saying before about how like our engineers, and I say our as like a community member of the Wikimedia, general movement here.
Yeah.
Our engineers, volunteer or otherwise, have the most complicated version of every problem. And this is a good example of it. It's like, well, we have to have it so that we can deploy only at certain times and that we don't have this big build process after a deploy because, of all these back-end concerns. Okay, fine. And then also we need it to be like dynamic because there's things changing on Wiki. And those things can change the modules that need to be downloaded. So like what about user scripts and user styles, and then later we even supported gadgets and things like that. So there's all this dynamic stuff going on. User interface messages are like changed on the wiki, and then that has to be reflected in the dynamic modules that are being downloaded, the JavaScript modules that include those messages. So this is a very unique problem that nobody else really had, and maybe still doesn't have, honestly. And so the way that ResourceLoader works is intentionally very, very dynamic. And we got it to the point where we could make it so that you could do a site-wide JavaScript rollout within 5 minutes without having to purge the front-end caches of all the pages, because we would basically give a 5-minute expiry time to the resource loader sort of startup module, and then everything else would be fresh from there on out. Whereas we had to make it so that all the varnish, or at the time squids, didn't have to be purged. And so this is like just an example of the kind of thing where we had to solve a much more complicated version of every single problem. But it ended up being that those more difficult constraints, I think, yielded a system that was more sophisticated, but not sophisticated just to be sophisticated, but to solve specific real problems that made it last longer.
Right. Yeah, it's more future-proof.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Briefly, do you remember what the impact was in terms of improved performance, at least on Wikipedia, of ResourceLoader?
I think we made some charts at the time. It was pretty huge. I mean, I think that the front page had something like 60-ish resources, and we got it down to like 4, and one of those was a logo. So it was, it was pretty big. The biggest thing is that the perception of performance is huge with these kinds of changes, because the browser behaves a lot differently when you have everything up front. A lot of times you would no longer see like the blank page before it loads type of experience.
Yeah.
And so, the actual experience of using the wiki, numbers aside, I think definitely was improved. But overall, I think the developer-focused features of ResourceLoader, the ease of being able to kind of put together complicated front-end packages without making the wiki slower, were so important to get done at that time, because that was a time where front-end stuff was just blowing up, and it was so many people were adding so many resources, and everybody was doing it in a different way, and most of them weren't very good. And so I think the timing was so important that if we hadn't put it in that place, it would have been much more difficult to shoehorn something in later. And in the meantime, I think the wiki would have screeched to a halt as far as front-end performance is concerned until that got resolved. So there was a certain amount of like foresight, I think, and in doing it at the time. But as I described before, it wasn't that we both thought, oh, this better get done before this mess happens. It was,
Right.
hey, we got these two engineers that are sort of not getting along over this thing that they both think is really important right now. And that's kind of really what precipitated its development more than anything.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Yeah, speaking as an extension developer, it really is. It's great how easy it is to define that one thing is dependent on another. That this JavaScript has to get loaded before this does. Versus I don't even know all the different hacks you could do to try to ensure that.
There's a lot of not very well known features of ResourceLoader as well, like the ability to define a module as a PHP class, and you can send arbitrary data as a JavaScript module or CSS module and things like that. And a lot of times I still see people kind of shooting themselves in the foot, doing weird things, hitting the API for like configuration information that they should have just passed as like a ResourceLoader data module or something like that. And so I can't say that we advertised all of these well enough, but I still think there are still like some gems in there that people are slowly learning how to use, and they can get you out a lot of binds.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I didn't know about that either.
Yeah.
Yeah, the module as PHP class thing sounds very intriguing. Is that documented anywhere?
It is. I'll send you a link that you can attach to the notes. But essentially, the ResourceLoader file module is a special module that sort of reads a lot of files off disk. But you can just create a class that inherits from ResourceLoader module and then implements just a few methods such as get scripts and get last modified time and things like that, and it can just return anything you want, and it can return information from the database or whatever. And so if you want something to behave like a module but you want its data to come from a dynamic source, that's the way to go.
That's interesting. Yeah, if I knew about that, I probably would have used it in a few places. Okay, good to know. All right, we'll get off this technical stuff.
No problem.
For all the people who aren't developing their own extensions that call ResourceLoader. So I guess this is a good time to move to get off of Wikimedia Foundation stuff. In 2017, not that long ago, you left the Wikimedia Foundation, started working for WikiHow.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was a director at the foundation, and I was overseeing all of the contribution stuff that was being developed, which is a challenging role for me, being an engineer and moving into middle management. I can't say I really enjoyed it, but I do feel like I think I did an all right job. But the foundation had grown really big and is still growing. So WikiHow is like 25 employees. It's a lot like the way the small kind of shop that I originally joined the foundation as. So, so that's been awesome. I've really enjoyed being at a smaller place where I can wear a lot of hats. As I've mentioned, I do design and engineering. I have a certain amount of product instinct. So I really enjoy doing, front end and back end and design and wearing all these different hats. And so that's been a really great place for me, being at a small shop again.
Yeah. At around the same time you left San Francisco and moved to New Hampshire, is that tied in at all?
No, I moved.
Okay.
I moved a bit before. So when the year before, so 1 year before I ended up leaving the foundation, I left San Francisco. I actually lived in Pacifica.
Okay.
And I moved to New Hampshire and became a Free Stater. So the Free State Project is a political movement, literally a migration to the state of New Hampshire, which is small and has a lot of political influence. And it allows us to develop a high concentration of like-minded, liberty-loving people who can get together and try and make the political landscape a little bit more about individual liberty and and that type of thing. And it's been having an impact.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Actually, I remember reading about the Free State Project back when it was first announced in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
But I had no idea until I saw your website that I actually knew someone who was part of it.
Yeah. Well, there aren't that many of us, to be fair. Over 20,000 people have pledged to move. I think that we probably have about 4,000 or 5,000 that have moved so far. To be fair, they only triggered the move a couple years ago. So the pledge was, if 20,000 other people sign, then I'll move.
Right.
And then when they got to 20,000 signatures, people did start moving maybe at an accelerated rate. But to be fair, a lot of people didn't wait around for the move to be triggered. People just started moving right away.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's not necessarily a binary thing.
And there's also a number of people who lived in New Hampshire already. And culturally out here, it's not that surprising to people to be a libertarian, very independent, freedom-loving folk out here anyway. There's a number of
free or die state.
That's right. There's a number of people, we call them in-staters, or whatever, or pre-staters, and they already lived here, but they're happy to participate in anything that helps progress liberty.
Yeah. This is not a political show. I do find it kind of hilarious that you moved from the People's Republic of San Francisco.
Yeah. I'm a political
Pacifica
refugee, as I like to say.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, there's really like three things here. One is I really love working from home. I have 3 kids. We homeschool all 3 of them.
Yeah, okay.
I love being part of their lives. So working from home was a very attractive thing to me. And that was increasingly becoming not just easy to do at the foundation, but just easy to do even around Silicon Valley. That's the days of everyone must be in the office, I think, are starting to fade. And so I wasn't too afraid of that anymore. I always kind of felt like, well, I'd love to maybe live outside of California, but how would I work? Because I work as an engineer, and so that obviously all the work is in Silicon Valley. But as working from home became more and more viable, that seemed like it would work great. And also, I think that we kind of fell in love with New Hampshire and the Free State Project, so it's just kind of like came together nicely.
Yeah. I definitely recommend working from home. I've been doing it for a long time. Actually, interestingly, there's been almost 50 guests on this podcast, a lot from the Wikimedia Foundation. And so far, I've only interviewed one person who works full-time at the Wikimedia Foundation office.
Yeah.
Even he's only there half the year, this guy,
right.
Gergo Tiza. But, not to harp on the political stuff, but I do find it interesting. In the context of the Wikimedia Foundation, I don't know if you have any thoughts on it, but the Wikimedia Foundation started off, of course, as non-political and actually vaguely libertarian. I mean,
Jimmy Wales says he's libertarian. I believe him.
Yeah, he's
I haven't
not just
discussed politics at length with him, but that seems great.
You haven't, or you?
I have not.
Okay, yeah.
But I think it at least says on his Wikipedia page or something like that. I think.
But I mean, he's often said that he was specifically influenced by a guy named Friedrich Hayek.
Yeah.
When
economist.
he was, first setting up the idea of Wikipedia as a public resource, and the Wikimedia Foundation, and the idea that there's no central. There's no central location of information, and the best thing is to let everyone be able to contribute.
Yeah,
what they know.
I've always seen a very strong connection between my political views, which are I guess based in libertarianism. Voluntarism, I guess, is probably the most relevant one, and the Wikipedia project. So. The Wikipedia project, I think, is an obvious success of voluntarism and decentralized power. And those are both things I think the world would be a little bit better place if we had more voluntarism and less centralized power. And so, just not to get too controversial with the politics, but essentially I think that there's an alignment there. And I always saw that in my work at the foundation. I mean, the foundation itself is made up of people. The community itself is made up of people. And those people have all sorts of different specific political views. That aside, I think that there is an underlying appreciation for the power of volunteer action and spontaneous organization. And to whatever degree people don't appreciate that, I think they're just not paying attention. Because it's really powerful, and it's happening and has been happening since the early 2000s on Wikipedia, and it's created such an immense resource, and the people involved are just doing it because they want to, not because they have to. I think that to me has always been really inspiring to see, and it was really fun to work with.
Yeah, it makes sense. On the other hand, if you look at, the public pronouncements of the Wikimedia Foundation, definitely in the last few years, it seems to have turned into more or less a left-wing advocacy organization. They put out statements about things you wouldn't think they would care about, like immigration and climate change.
Yeah. Well, it's really important. It's really, really important to understand. The foundation is not the community. It's not made up of the community. It's not really even asked for by the community. It's a completely separate entity with its own goals. And I'm not saying whether they're good or bad. I'm just saying is that they have nothing to do with the community. And so the community is what built Wikipedia. They're the ones who can take Wikipedia and walk away with it if they want. Maybe someday they will, maybe they won't, I don't know. But it's really important that, like, the whole time I spent at the foundation, it did not make me a community member. And there's a huge delineation in interests between the two. And so it's really it's unfortunate because obviously the foundation has this megaphone, and it's easy for outsiders who don't really see the stark delineation between the two groups to think that whatever the foundation says is representative of the community. And I think that that's not the best situation. But yeah, I mean, to me, it's like totally night and day, very different interests. And, I'll let you take that for what it is. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. Although, of course, sometimes the lines get blurred. Every once in a while, the Wikimedia Foundation puts out a post or something saying, complaining about some specific thing on Wikipedia. And there was one egregious case I remember where there was a woman who got the Nobel Prize, and she didn't have a Wikipedia article until she won the Nobel Prize, and everyone pointed to that as a big problem, which maybe it was, but it was just weird the way they handled it. They put out a post saying, if you want to make sure this kind of error doesn't happen again, you should, become a Wikipedia editor and take part in deletion arguments and something. All but blaming the editors who are involved in that specific issue, because she had an article and it got deleted. Right. So they were essentially saying, these people made an error, and we need you to fight them and help fix future errors that these people might make, that kind of thing.
Well, first off, there's a lot of people that are part of the actual community who have wildly varying political views, and I think some of them are going to be really aggressive and try and use that platform to progress their views. But to be fair, the platform, I don't think technologically advantages any particular view. So an equally aggressive person with an opposing view has the same exact opportunity to progress that. So you're going to see some isolated cases here and there. But to be fair, I mean, there are just as many people who think that there's a bunch of examples of right-wing extremism on Wikipedia as there are people who think that there's a bunch of examples of left-wing extremism or any other wing or any other persuasion, because it's just vast, and generally you're going to be able to find a lot of skew where the community maybe doesn't desire there to be any, but there's going to be. So it's hard, like, because you're kind of talking about an anecdotal case that maybe got some heat, but there's just so many examples, and counter examples or anything like that. I think I've kind of like learned to take it in stride and just trust in like the process. Like to me, the important thing is that there's there's an equal there's a level playing field, that no one has a granted monopoly, which is maybe a problem with the foundation because obviously they have a granted monopoly. And so if, just speaking strategically or, conceptually here, if there's anyone that you should be careful about trusting, it's whoever has a monopoly on something. And surely the foundation currently is in a position where they have a monopoly on much of what is the Wikimedia kind of universe there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Who watches the watchers?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah, it's tricky. That said, I mean, I really want to make sure it's clear that my experience at the foundation is that it is made up of a bunch of really amazing people, some of which have come from the community, some not, who really care a lot about the project. The biggest problem is when people don't really understand it, and I can't claim to perfectly understand it either, even though I spent 9 years trying to improve it. But I really do believe that all these people are well-intentioned, both the volunteers who spend their own personal time, but even these people who are paid. There is a real big sense of trying to do better by each other, and which is a really great environment to be in. But it is also unfortunate because there are a lot of people who become politically radicalized and choose to try and use whatever platform they can get their hands on to progress that. And I kind of think that's a bummer.
Yeah. That's interesting too. That's a whole separate discussion. I don't know if we want to get into that, but there's such a big deal made out of paid advocacy and paid editing and stuff, where people have some ulterior motives, but at the same time, there's so many people who just edit to push a particular point of view.
Well, and it can be worth a lot of money to somebody to have their Wikipedia page say one thing or another. I remember there was this guy who was like a friend of a friend of a friend. It was just some distant relationship, and never met the guy in person ever. Somehow he gets my phone number and he calls me and he wants me to edit a Wikipedia article.
Oh, wow.
And no chance I'm going to do this for him. First, I'm not really an editor. I have no interest in helping this. I don't know who this person is. And also, everything the guy says sounds really dodgy. But because he kind of claims to know somebody my parents know or something, I at least hear him out. And he's essentially trying to get me to change an article about his boss that says, basically just states some facts about some lawsuit or something like that. And I'm like, I'll just give him some advice so he can give it a shot on his own. I'm not going to get involved in this. So then I look it up. And it was last rewritten by Michael Snow. And I told him...
Oh, I remember that guy.
I told him, well, I don't think that you're going to succeed. This is a very established and well-respected member of the community here who's recently rewritten this article. I doubt you're going to do well. But it made me think about this because, Michael Snow, who I think, probably did a fantastic job writing that article in a very, fair way or whatever, and this other guy who's got this ulterior motive, I could certainly tell you which one I would trust between the two. But that said, there are people on Wikipedia who, because they've earned it, because they've worked really hard and developed that trust over time, do wield more authority than someone who just shows up and edits the first time. And that can be really, difficult for people coming in early on in their editing careers to really feel like that is egalitarianism. Because you have these people who everyone sees as essentially untouchable, or at least ultimately trustable, and then there's them, and they're even if they're well-meaning, unlike this one guy I'm explaining, it can be really hard for them to really appreciate why is it that we trust Michael Snow. And so I think that a lot of the challenges to me, toward the end of the time that I was working at the foundation, the biggest challenges to me had to do with trying to surface that kind of information in the review process, so that when someone's reviewing you, you understand who they are and why they're an important person to listen to. But also in ways that, like, a lot of these established editors have maybe gotten a little bit grumpy or irritated by having to fix the same thing 100 times. And so, maybe ways to make it so those interactions are kinder. I really think that those are the kind of things that are going to be the most important to the success of the project ongoing, or at least into the future, because that division is just growing deeper and deeper and deeper. And there's been very, very little investment, at least not very much effective investment, if any at all, in solving that problem. And I would just say that, like, the last 4 or 5 times I've presented publicly on VisualEditor, the first 25% of my talk is about that, which has nothing to do with VisualEditor, on its surface. But essentially, it's like VisualEditor can take a barrier away, but the thing is, there's so many barriers that are just lying right behind it. And we have to get all those out too, or else people are just going to hit just the next brick wall. And I'm really happy that I was able to participate in downing one of those brick walls, and I think we really toppled it great. But there's 3 or 4 right behind it, and most of them have to do with these types of things. So that's, I think, where the most investment needs to be put from volunteers or staff, engineers, or whoever. To try and take some of those barriers down, or else you're not really going to see any progress in that area.
Yeah, is that a technical challenge? I mean, are there technical solutions to that kind of thing? If I even understand the problem correctly, of power editors who just squash the minions.
Well, I don't mean to make them sound bad. I think there's some technology to it, but probably not like some really advanced, amazing technology. I think actually the reason why it hasn't really been done as much is because it's the hardest problems to solve. It's, just as much as when we were sitting in that room and that user interface design consulting company told us you need a WYSIWYG editor, and everyone starts looking at each other like, oh my gosh, we have no idea where to start. We have no idea how to do that. I mean, we're all still just clueless on how to tackle this next set of problems. We just don't know. And hopefully there's going to be some people who have some better ideas and everything. But I think a huge amount of it isn't just the technology. It is also like the community needs to be really involved. And the relationship between where most of the engineers are and how they're tasked right now and the community, it's really distant. And that needs to be much closer. There needs to be a lot better relationship between editors and engineers, for them to be able to be speaking the same language and understanding these problems better, or else I don't think they're going to make much progress on this anytime soon. I think it's a really hard problem space for sure.
Well, so is the main challenge, just making things easier for new editors, or changing the behavior of, the people who wield too heavy a hand in reverting everyone else?
Yeah, I think it's more facilitating mentorship through software. There's a bunch of new editors that have no interest in really sticking around, and there's a bunch of existing editors that aren't really that interested in being nice. There's no nicer way that you're going to be able to facilitate for. They're going to find a way to express their anger, I guess. I don't know. It's not about changing people's behavior. It's saying that there's a huge amount of really well-meaning people already there. And what we want to do is we want to facilitate that onboarding process. I know that there's been a little bit done here and there on this, but frankly, it's usually just like scratching the surface. It's really, it's a really basic and not very, not very comprehensive way of doing it. So they'll fix one little tiny thing in a little sample, and they'll say, oh, that worked really well, but then that never really becomes a product or a big initiative. So hopefully that'll change. But I just think the onboarding process is really, really difficult because it's not really a wiki unless you can edit and review and revert and message each other, and we've really only made it easier to edit.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's that ongoing project to improve talk pages. I'm looking forward to see what they come up with that.
Yeah, I hope some point that'll actually succeed, because that's been going on. Liquid threads became flow, became all these things. But That's probably mostly plagued with a lot of the same problems, and that's a tough space. I think that making it easier to talk to each other is important, but like review is not a very fun thing to work on, but it's so bad. It's just so bad. It needs to be improved, just as much as we've improved editing.
Okay, that's interesting. What's an example of sorry.
Take your time.
What do you mean by reviewing? I mean,
well, the current way that you notice that there's something that's changed, evaluate the change, respond to the change. This is all done on like the diff pages, basically the history pages. All those tools are still pretty coarse, and they don't really facilitate a lot of human interaction.
Right.
They don't really reveal the intention. They don't really capture the intention of the edit either. And there's just a lot of stuff there. A good example is like, imagine if when you were reviewing a change, you were able to see how that change was put together by being able to like watch it be played back, or you were able to quickly get in touch with the person who had just a second ago, and it's certainly still on the wiki, right? Like people looking at recent changes, you were able to just instantly start chatting with that person about what they had done, rather than there being this like huge amount of latency where they maybe never even come back. And these are really simple things. And I don't know that these are the best ideas. I'm just saying these are really simple things, but there's just not been a lot of attention paid to this area. And certainly, like, if anyone's paid attention to it, they usually do it at like the program level, which is sort of foundation speak for non-engineering. And then if there's any engineering stuff done, it's usually like way too complicated, way too like far-reaching, and it ends up just being something only for power users and not really focusing on entry-level users.
Okay, yeah, that's it. That's actually very interesting. Yeah, there used to be a few chat extensions on Mediawiki, just as far as the chat is concerned.
Chat's hard because how do you moderate chat? How do you prevent abuse? Things like that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Like I said, I'm not saying those are the best ideas. I'm just saying that, like, just to kind of open your mind to like possibilities. I mean, we could do anything, and there's just not been a lot of focus on those barriers that stand right behind editing. And like I said, for it to be a wiki, you've got to be able to edit, review, talk to each other, revert things. And, there's been tons and tons of focus on just one of those, maybe two of those, a little bit, and very little on the others.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this fully gets what you're saying, but I am looking forward to when to visual diffs becoming standard. Using VisualEditor to more easily show what changed between one version and the next.
Well, there's an amazingly talented engineer named Talia Chan who had basically took VisualEditor change information, which is more granular than just a simple three-way diff, and was able to produce a visual diff that's used within VisualEditor. You can use it today. That is much more nuanced and sophisticated, and really speaks to the actual intent of the change that was made, much, much more than a typical three-way diff ever could. Things like moving a paragraph down would normally look like just a jumbled, giant, huge, monolithic change. Right. And in this, it elegantly just shows you it was moved down and a word was changed, right? She did an amazing job on that, and I hope that technology can make it into like the core platform rather than just being something that's surfaced only through VisualEditor.
Yeah, me too. And that's a good person to have on the podcast, also. Okay, so this seems like a good time to move to talk about WikiHow.
Sure.
Well, you talked about the work environment and so forth. WikiHow is a very big deal. Although I don't know exactly how big. How big is WikiHow in terms of traffic and size? Do you know?
One of the things that's great about working at WikiHow is that my daily, focus has nothing to do with money or traffic. And to great credit to my boss, I think, for having the insight to understand that as an engineer, it's not that I'm not motivated by improving things for the company, but that I have engineering problems to solve. And so, unlike at the foundation, frankly, where I think that kind of thing was just like everything was about money and everything was about traffic all the time. Thankfully, I'm a bit separated from that. But that said, I think it's considered to be like in the top 150 as far as traffic's concerned. Certainly, users are somewhere in the hundreds of millions. It's a pretty big user base.
Wow. Yeah. What kind of projects have you worked on for WikiHow?
So one of the big things is just updating Mediawiki. So it's interesting to be on the other side of the fence.
Right.
We're like downstream of Mediawiki updates, and we were at some ancient version. And had to get up to from 124 to 132 or something like that. And so that was an interesting experience. It was helpful that I knew a bunch of people at the foundation I could ask questions to directly. But yeah, that I think that part of what I've been able to kind of help WikiHow with a lot is just my deeper expertise in Mediawiki as a platform and being able to get things up to date. The other thing I've been working on a lot there is WikiHow's moving, toward video a bit. I think is pretty obvious on the site. We have more and more videos all the time, and I built the Apple TV app to be able to watch WikiHow videos on your couch, and I also built a web app so that you can sort of go to WikiHow and just only be watching videos. So sort of there's like a next up related video kind of functionality to it, sort of like watching YouTube, but it's only like the thousands of videos that we have compared to the millions that they have, obviously. But yeah, and we have lots of video content that's nicely produced and has a consistent feel to it. And so so I've been working a lot on that. I really think video is a really important part of the future of the web, as well as WikiHow. So
sure, yeah, and that stuff's not Mediawiki related at all, I assume.
I mean, yeah, it just kind of sits on top of Mediawiki. I mean, all the content is still derived from the wiki. Just to be fair.
Okay, yeah, but right.
Well, I feel like that's like the only way I know how these days is like everything. So I've been working on wikis for so long. But yeah, it's like a technology that just sits right on top of that.
Yeah. Yeah, as far as updating all the software, I guess it's somewhat tied in to the fact that you're not hosting your extensions on the Wikimedia Foundation repository, that kind of thing. I mean, I have to ding you guys a little bit.
Yeah.
I think WikiHow has something like dozens of custom extensions, but only a few of them have been released as open source.
Yeah, I think that so far my understanding of this is that has probably more to do with the pace at which we're changing things, and maybe just not having the best open source habits, rather than it being sort of a this is our secret sauce, we have to keep it private kind of thing. I think when I joined, Jack certainly has an interest in participating more and more in open source, and we still have freely licensed content and things like that. So, but at the same time, it is a company that has to pay bills using advertising money essentially. So there's some differences for sure, but I think that the desire is to participate as much as we can in the open source community. And
yeah. Wait, the paying bills means that you just how does paying bills relate to?
It means that the
open
primary
source?
focus is Like we'll actually have engineers that work on like advertising, right?
Well, okay. Yeah.
Whereas at the foundation, there's a lot more resources devoted to maintaining a lot of open source libraries and doing release schedules and all that kind of stuff. Where, yeah, the priorities end up being different, and I think that is a challenge for any hybrid organization, which I think WikiHow kind of likes to sort of trying to achieve, which is that we're trying to do as much social good as possible, but we also want to be sustainable.
Right.
As a business, and so there's some balance there. And I don't know that much about the business side of things. It's just that I do know that there's a desire to participate as much as we can, and we send things upstream and things like that too. And to be fair, a lot of these extensions wouldn't be that useful outside of like our exact content, our exact body of content anyway.
Okay, yeah, that's possible. Yeah, by the way, you mentioned Jack before. I assume that's the CEO, Jack Herrick.
Yeah, very good guy. He's not like the day-to-day CTO anymore. He's stepped back, but he's the owner. He's still involved,
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, one potential usage is I had on the podcast someone from WikiFab, which is also a how-to MediaWiki based site, although they're just focused on DIY type things. But they also have they provide software to let other people run their own sites, similar sites. I don't know if that's something you guys have looked into, like enterprise WikiHow, that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, I don't know that we have. I mean, I think that the focus is really on this sort of hybrid model of community content, but then we also get really talented artists involved in enhancing that content, skilled writers involved in copy editing that content, sometimes also writing articles from scratch and everything too. So there's really like we have a community. We even get them together every once in a while, but it's we sort of support them with, which I guess you'd say like paid editing. It's basically paid copy editing and a lot of paid illustration and even video production. And I think it really that's a very different game, because we're able to do things on the wiki like have high quality illustrations for every single step, for instance, that we just couldn't do otherwise. Not that it wasn't tried, but it just wasn't. It wasn't quite the same amount of productivity and quality as what we're able to achieve now.
Yeah. Those WikiHow illustrations have sort of taken on a life of their own, from what I understand.
They have. There's really specific art guidelines. I'm not super familiar with all of them, but they sort of have a certain style. They have this soft palette. They're meant to be illustrations that can convey the concept even without text, which I think
right.
one of the really cool things I think about with WikiHow is how much people who can't really read very well or at all are able to still use the site. We do really well in areas that have low literacy rates in comparison to other sites that are more text-based. Because of that, because WikiHow, they can figure out how to do it by just looking at the pictures. And so I think that's really cool. Obviously, in the Western world, we just take literacy for granted, but there's so many parts of the world still where literacy is pretty bad. And being able to produce content that helps those people in their lives, I think that's really cool. I feel like that's a really important social good that we're able to do.
Yeah, that's really neat. Yeah. I guess people have made fun of WikiHow illustrations for sort of being overly literal or coming off strange in that way. But I can see that really can make a difference.
And some of them, you take them out of context, they can be absolutely hilarious. And that is not lost on us. We really appreciate how funny that is, and are big fans of a lot of those memes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I want to ask, so having worked behind the scenes of both WikiHow and Wikipedia, which you can't really compare the two, but they are both giant by any real standard. Is there the same sort of, I don't know if I would call it fear of the users, but at Wikipedia, there's certainly always a trepidation, it seems, about making changes to the interface because there are going to be a lot of power users that will be up in arms if there's something they don't like. Is there that same kind of
very different
worry or concern at
Yeah.
WikiHow if you suddenly consider changing the interface?
From my experience, it's been very different. There's been just like such a positive reaction anytime you're able to do something that helps people out. I think it might be part of the factor is it's a smaller community, and maybe it's a healthier community. It's hard to really say the differences, but it's night and day difference though. I mean the community is really, really positive. And all the interactions that I've had and things that I've done that have touched them have been really well received, and that was in great contrast to Wikipedia. The thing is about Wikipedia is that I think millions of people really liked a lot of the things I did, the improvements I made. I just never heard from them because that's not the culture.
Right.
The culture is like if you like it, you shut your mouth. Move along, and if you hate it, then you rant and find someone to make their life difficult. And that it took me a while to get used to that. But I don't like kind of like look at the Wikipedia community as just being all mean. I just know that like a lot of the people who appreciated what I was doing, unless I saw them face to face at Wikimania or something like that, I just never hear it.
Yeah, no, yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, so are WikiHow users more vocal about stuff they do like, or just less vocal about stuff they don't like?
They're much more vocal about what they like, and I saw that immediately, and I was like, this is awesome. I really like that. It makes me feel good, and maybe it's just because I was so used to the opposite that it felt like really stark in contrast to me. But
yeah. Cool. Well, I have a few more questions. They're not Mediawiki related.
Go ahead,
so
real quick.
For people, just saying, for people who have invested the time and because we're already nearing 2 hours. You can drop off now. Although I think we're still going to be talking about interesting stuff.
You're
anyway,
good.
So back to stuff that's quasi-political and also I think software related. You've been somewhat involved in the case of a guy named Ross Ulbricht. I think it has some interesting implications for the software world in general. So first of all, could you briefly explain who he is?
Yeah, I mean, he's the Silk Road guy, right? So he created a website that made it possible to, do anonymous transactions between, two parties or whatever, and got shut down and rather unjustly treated and is now in jail serving multiple life sentences.
Yeah. I looked more into it. There are a bunch of crazy aspects to his sentencing, like the fact that two of the main agents who went after him are now in jail themselves because they tried to steal money during the investigation.
I was fortunate enough to hear a presentation by his mother last year at a conference called Liberty Forum, which is actually happening this coming weekend again this year. Anyway, so the craziest thing to me is actually that at the end of the trial, during sentencing, there were additional charges that were brought and not really evaluated in a typical way, and used as justification for a much more extreme sentence, not only than anybody would really suspect he would deserve, but even than other people involved at similar levels received. So it was kind of thrown in that, because there was some suspected or proven human trafficking on the site, which again, he had nothing to do any more than Craig Newmark has to do with prostitution on Craigslist, right? But then because of that, he was given like back-to-back life sentences, and it was this really extreme, harsh punishment that kind of reeked of trying to make an example out of anybody who tries to do something similar.
Yeah, the whole thing comes off really as a kind of a show trial. I thought you were actually going to mention the fact that he was accused of putting out a hit on a few people, which, whether or not it happened, he was never tried for or charged with.
Yeah.
But they still mentioned it. They still talked about it when sentencing him.
Yeah, I think that was another aspect of it. And so there was just a lot of really weird things going on. And the Free State Project, which, obviously I participate in, has been good friends to the Ulrich family, and hopefully we'll be able to do whatever, raise whatever awareness is necessary to get him pardoned, or to have that whole case, at least a retrial or something, because it is, to me, having seen, an admittedly biased presentation, but having seen, the facts laid out and doing some more research to kind of look into it myself, it seems like a pretty obvious abuse of the justice system by somebody trying to make an example of somebody. And I don't think he was being treated justly at all. And I think it probably speaks more to the government's, I guess, fear possibly of this type of thing being done on the internet, and how easily people are able to bypass all the mechanisms in which the government typically gets involved in every transaction in our lives.
Yeah. And for people who don't know, I guess the main thing being sold on Silk Road was illegal drugs.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of like one of these things where, people also sold sofas, but that's not like the reason why you'd want to operate in cryptocurrency. And so, and I really look at it like Craigslist has tons and tons of illegal activity on it all the time, again, right? But because they're not facilitating the transaction as far as like getting involved at all in, there's cryptocurrency being, changing hands, I guess somehow they get a free pass, or I don't know, to whatever Silk Road even did that. So it's just, there's a bit of a double standard that I think has been applied there, and it seems like the only difference appears to be the use of cryptocurrency, which attracted a lot more overt misbehavior, illegal activity, rather than the more covert activity that's a little bit that's happening all the time on something like Craigslist, for instance.
Sure. One reason I wanted to ask you about it is I have a theory about the whole thing, which I'm curious what you think about it. The theory is that possibly he was just the victim of very bad timing. I mean, he created Silk Road in 2011. He was arrested in 2013. In retrospect, that period of time might have been the height of government paranoia about the internet.
Yeah, that's possible.
So just briefly, I mean, in 2000 was the year of the SOPA and PIPA acts, which took a very heavy-handed approach to copyright issues, and the English language Wikipedia was actually blacked out for a day to protest those.
Yeah.
And then I thought of two high-profile piracy arrests that happened around that time. There was Aaron Swartz in 2011 and a guy named Kim.com in 2012. Those were fairly, different from one another, and it seems strange to even put them in the same sentence. But I thought it was interesting that they both happened around that time period. And then finally, 2011 was also the year that there's a guy named Cory Doctorow who made a somewhat famous presentation called "The Coming War on General Computation," where he argued that computers, as we know them, would eventually come under legal threat because prosecutors would figure out that that's really the only way to prevent people from doing bad things online.
Yeah.
So I don't know. So that all happened, 8-9 years ago. There hasn't been a war on general computation yet. And maybe people in the government in general have relaxed about the internet to some extent since then. So maybe the worst is behind us. I don't know. What do you think about all that?
Well, if you saw any of the like C-SPAN coverage of these hearings with Zuckerberg trying to defend and explain his position to a bunch of politicians who know nothing about technology.
Right.
I don't know if it's really over. I think they probably just changed tact. I mean, at this point, I think I'm really concerned about internet regulations being being just around the corner. Things like Soap and Pippa are really high profile examples, but I think what they learned probably from those type of things is that they had a really high profile case. They didn't make it very well to the American public. There was enough backlash. They didn't, things didn't go well for them. But there's certainly going to be probably a bunch of lower profile, intentionally lower profile changes that are made kind of that will probably have more profound effect. I think like the lesson that they likely learned is that the general public is not really on their side. And by they, I mean anybody in the government that wants to regulate free speech on the internet.
Right.
And things around that. And so they're going to have to, come up with a different way to sell it. And I'm not sure what that thing is, but it seems like they're probably haven't lost interest. I think that they're just changing their tactics.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. The Zuckerberg thing was Facebook is coming out with their own cryptocurrency or something.
Yeah. Well, even before that, because there was a lot of there were some hearings about whether different points of view were being treated with equal kind of
Oh yeah.
handedness,
Sure.
and a bunch of cases and counter cases of left and then right wing and then back to left wing and whatever cases where they're saying, well, Facebook didn't allow me to say what I wanted to say, that kind of thing. And they were kind of examining whether these social media platforms have too much power. But I actually think I'm not much into making future predictions, but when you're brought before Congress or the Senate and asked a bunch of questions, by the time they're hip to what you're doing, you're like 5 steps ahead of them. I mean, they're like that. They are so far behind the curve. And it's obvious by the the way that their lines of questioning were just like, have you even used a computer before? Like, it's just silly. Like they're not going to get anything from these hearings, but they're doing that as a way to show their constituents that they care about these issues. And I think that's typically foreshadowing that there's going to be more legislation in the future that's going to be presented by the kind of people who are interested in trying to drag these people in front of public trial like that.
Yeah. So you generally take the side of the tech companies on all this, saying whatever good or bad things they do, they should be allowed to do those.
Okay, well, you're assuming that the tech companies believe in free speech. It's important to note that almost every single one of these tech CEOs welcomed regulation. And the reason why is that they are the best suited to deal with any regulation. The U.S. government puts some new law in place. Who's better suited to do that? Small internet operations or really big ones? So really big ones have teams of lawyers and they can make all this happen and they can just continue business as usual and it knocks out competition. In this way,
Right.
What the biggest fear I have is that the internet is going to become regulated in a way that the biggest companies can sort of maneuver around and afford, and the smallest ones cannot, and it'll become kind of like an occupational licensing problem. That's where there's a lot of rules that are, they seem like they're for public safety, but they're really to keep people out of the business, which pushes prices up, or in this case, profit.
Sure. Yeah. It's just raising the barrier to entry, as they say.
Yeah, and if you're familiar with like the Institute for Justice and the work that they do, they're often fighting these kinds of battles in Main Street America, where there's people who are like being denied the ability to operate the business that they've been running for a really long time, or they're being denied the ability to get into a business that would really help them in their lives because of some arbitrary licensing rules. gone awry.
Okay, yeah, that's not software. That's not tech related anymore. You're just that's a general problem.
But you could see that kind of problem could arise in the tech space if we allow too much regulation of the internet. The only companies that'll be able to follow the regulations will be the biggest, most powerful companies, and that I'm against. So that's why I kind of differentiate. It's not that I'm like pro big tech company, because I actually don't even think that they are pure in their belief of free speech, because they have business interests and could potentially be swayed by that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I don't want to end the episode on a down note. So let's talk about music. You're one of a number of people who've been on this show who do music on the side, although in your case, you really fully produce your own music in addition to being in some bands.
Yeah.
From what I understand. I listened to some of your music. It's cool. Yeah. I hear elements of trip hop in there. Indie rap.
Some of my really early stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There's indie rap. Some of it sounds like a guy named Aesop Rock.
I know who that is. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I haven't done hip hop in a long time, but a lot of the stuff's still out there. And like early on, I was in a grunge band with my brother, like a high school grunge band, and we made a record, and that was really fun. And then I got involved in producing hip hop for some friends, and did a couple albums of that kind of stuff. Not all of that is out on the internet, but I also I think it influenced some of my own personal music for a while, and so yeah, there's some of that. There's some of that out there. Some nerd rap, I guess you'd probably call it.
I wasn't gonna say no. You could call it that, I guess.
It's not that my stuff's that great, but I think there's a genre called nerdcore that is like goes further down that road.
I've heard of this thing. Yeah, it's not really my thing, but yeah. So actually, I think you're the first rapper who's been on this podcast.
Yeah. Although I can't claim to be that great at it. My most recent stuff, I think, has gotten has gotten a lot closer to my rock roots. I have a band called Western Galaxy. We have a couple singles out, and I do all the music production and backup vocals, and I work with another guy, Dave Laverne, and he does lead vocals and a lot of the lyrics.
Cool. Are you all? Do you meet in person? Are you all?
I met him here in New Hampshire, but he actually moved to North Dakota, and we're still working together. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think the wonderful thing about the internet is the ability to like make records across long distances, which that's how the Postal Service got their name, although they weren't using the internet necessarily, obviously. But making records across long distances is one of the cool things about technology.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Are you? So you're still creating music? You're still putting out music?
I had a band when I lived in California called Since, and we're still sort of polishing a little bit. I think our first single we're actually going to probably release in the next month or so. And so even though we're not jamming together anymore, we recorded so much material that we have like 3 singles, 2 EPs, and like a full album, that I'm sort of just working through. And so some of it's going to be coming out over the next year or so. Should be fun.
Cool. That's really cool. I'll have links to some or all of your acts.
Cool.
There on the
thanks,
podcast episode page. Yeah. Well, I think we just hit the 2-hour mark.
Yeah. You can just cut it all out. That's okay. Just chop that down.
No, this is great. Yeah, it's all good stuff. It's all gold.
Well, thanks for having me on, man. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, it was great talking to you. Thanks a lot for being on the podcast.
Yeah, take it easy.
And that was another episode of Between the Brackets. I want to again thank my guest, Trevor Parscal of the Wikimedia Foundation and now WikiHow. And yes, it is Pascal and not Parscal or anything else, even though it has the extra R in there. Thanks for listening. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you next time.